What lies at the bottom of the PlayStation Store? Ever found yourself scrolling through the store trying to find something interesting until you scroll too far? At some point you'll cross the PlayStation Store event horizon, full of games that have fallen from popular grace or never had it to begin with. Certain questions may arise, like, is there nothing interesting, are the deals not good enough, and am I hemorrhaging? Today, I'm taking the last 10 games on the store list during the January sale, getting all of their trophies and reviewing them. It's very much a concept similar to Iron Pineapple's series, where he takes several lowly rated Souls-like games from Steam, except that while he knows the general game concept he's getting into, I don't. And I'm ready to be ruined by it. Please subscribe for my sanity. So, kick back and relax as we go into the last game on the list, Cuties Hacked. And, Cuties Hacked is a very particular sort of game, as in the sort of game that I'd particularly not cover on a small channel that is just starting to get barely noticed by the algorithm. So, I'm sorry, controversial as this may be, I've made a decision not to include it in the 10 games for this video.
That's so upsetting.
Though it is kind of interesting how the game goes for 2 cents and its DLCs are more pricey. Very interesting sales strategy there. Moving on, the first game on our list is Murdered Soul Suspect, and this is interesting. I knew that this game was not looked upon kindly way back when it was released, but it never sank in for me how bad its reception really was. So bad that now it's literally a bottom of the barrel product, locked away at the end of the store never to be seen again by anyone. Well, except for people like me. Published by Square Enix, I thought at the time that this was a big budget release, and my intention with this video is to cover stuff people haven't heard about. But I already skipped one game, so in we go. In Soul Suspect you play as Ronan O'Connor, a used to be a criminal who, despite having an extensive repertoire of crimes, became a police detective. Yeah, I don't know how this makes sense either. The game starts with his death while attempting to capture a local serial killer, the Bell Killer. Ronan becomes a ghost but cannot move on to the afterlife yet with his deceased wife due to unfinished business, and thus starts his quest to posthumously capture the murderer. Now let's talk about what the game does on paper and what its gameplay is actually like, because that, right there, is the problem. As a ghost, Ronan can pass through objects, people and walls, which is really cool, except for the fact that the camera is not coded to actually handle this. You can also possess people and do things like influencing their actions, read their minds, eavesdrop on conversations, or peek at what they're looking at. This sounds cool, doesn't it? Well, what the game actually does with this concept is just disappointing. The game is structured linearly, with different levels connected through an overworld, so the idea of being a ghost and passing freely through walls is really limited. The justification is that houses are consecrated, so you're essentially stuck to paths when you're outside. However, there's also some ghostly objects and walls that appear for some reason, and that limits your movement even more. But once you're inside a level, the ability to freely move really shines. It shines so much in fact that you can sequence break some sections. There's this bit when you have 2 crime scenes, but you're supposed to find one after the other. And if you solve the second without solving the first, the game is like, yeah, you're done here. It's like the devs didn't really know how to handle this amount of freedom of movement, and this lack of competency combined with a lack of commitment is quite obvious. And when it comes down to possessing people and using those cool abilities, the game lets you down again. All these things about influencing, peeking, eavesdropping are just used like once or twice each, and to an effect that is not at all spectacular. I would have also said that being able to possess and read the mind of literally any NPC is cool, until I discovered that most of this stuff is just repeated. Also, there's this NPC that just condemns you to a fate worse than death. When you choose to read the mind of a character, they have to finish their line before you can leave, and she just straight up doesn't have one, but the game waits for her to say something. Anyway, that softlock aside, the usage of these abilities is not inspired, and what I think contributes to that is the game's rigid structure. When you're investigating, you know exactly how many clues there are to find, and the game simply doesn't have a fail state. It does have a point system that deducts a badge each time you get something wrong, but it literally does nothing. The game simply lets you keep going. But the way you interact with clues is quite standard, you just go to them and pick them up. And I think the game would have benefited from something more flexible, like getting things wrong, leading to the story unraveling differently, or having multiple ways to find a clue with a wider application of your possession abilities and influencing NPCs in more inventive and involved ways. And this does happen to be to a small extent extent there. You can screw around with electronics, and even though this old guy doesn't react to you screwing with his TV, despite watching it, there are some sections where you have to help someone sneak around by distracting threats. This is neat, and it made me think of how cool it would be if more effort would be put into these NPC interactions. Instead, a lot of effort seems to be put into the game's collectibles, of which there are many. You could genuinely tell me that this is a Ubisoft game and I would believe you. Ultimately, Murdered Sole Suspect is just disappointing and incredibly pedestrian. And before we move on, I just really want to stress that the concept of this game is really good. Like, I really hope a studio picks the idea up and tries to do something genuinely creative. Imagine a sandbox game where you could literally pass through anything, influence any NPC in inventive ways to find interesting things or clues, find rooms that are meant to be hidden, and witness things like, I don't know, a cult meeting by being somewhere at the precise time and place. These ideas can really lead to a fantastic detective thriller story, and while this game deserves to be forgotten, this concept absolutely doesn't. It's a great foundation, and I hope someone builds something memorable with it. Next up on our list is Police Stories. Not the most creative name. Created by Hype Train Digital and Mighty Morgan, it follows the story of two cops as they bust crime scenes and uncover a conspiracy that threatens the entire city. Now, by the look of this gameplay, I think it's quite obvious that it's very reminiscent of Hotline Miami, albeit a bit more grounded and not as psychedelic. But despite this similarity, what I like about Police Stories is that it goes in a very different direction. While Hotline Miami is about frantically killing everything in your vicinity, Police Stories is about taking a more considerate approach. You see, despite being set in what I believe to be America, the game encourages you to be as peaceful as possible and only shoot as a final resort. It's not about having the quick reflexes to dispose of enemies, but about being able to balance that while also convincing them to surrender. While enemies are as deadly as they can be, the game gives you just a sliver of time to try and coerce them into standing down, which is crucial because you can try to command them to stand down or fire a warning shot if that doesn't work, and even then they may not surrender. And you don't want to shoot someone until you're convinced they won't stand down, because otherwise you lose points. However, you still get less points if they die, so you're pushed to coerce a peaceful resolution, because if you don't have enough points, you're not allowed into the next level. And there's also a trophy for completing every level with a certain grade. The game demands a lot and it can feel quite unforgiving, but I found it absolutely satisfying. Discovering new ways to subdue enemies using its stealth system, it feels great. And while the game gets harder with bigger levels and more mechanics, it also gives you more tools to approach situations better and differently. Ways to detect NPCs through doors, various grenades to incapacitate enemies, or offensive alternatives like a ballistic shield to tackle threats head-on. But what is absolutely beautiful is the range of behaviors any one NPC can have. From enemies that won't surrender to those who drop their weapon as soon as they see you, it's incredibly varied. Some will run away, some will just stand their ground trying to argue with you, and you can never feel too safe because even if they have surrendered, unless you cuff them, they may get back up while your back is turned. And it all goes deeper, as sounds you make can alert nearby enemies, making them investigate or making them react much faster when they see you. Then you also have civilians, and much like enemies, they also react in a variety of ways. They run away, argue with you, and some are even disguised enemies. This is very compelling, but overall what I thoroughly enjoyed is that it actually tackles an issue that is hardly if ever addressed in games. What if enemies just don't want to fight you? What if they could be talked down? What if they don't want to die? In a gaming environment that reduces enemies to red dots on a map, a visually gorgeous 8-bit game made to emulate decades-old games manages to do something ahead of its time. And that is fantastic. I cannot recommend this game enough. Next up on our list is Seicross, released in 1984 by Nichibutsu, please tell me I'm not mispronouncing that, and ported to modern consoles by Hamster Corporation, is part of a broad initiative of porting old arcade games to accessible modern consoles as a part of their Arcade Archives series. And honestly, I'm all for it. In an industry where games become inaccessible because of license issues and have features or get shut down entirely, because studios don't want to keep supporting something you may have already paid for, it's just nice to see a company giving a slight fuck about the archival of games. And what's nice is that they also add some modern features, like online global scoreboards. They even kept the feature of inserting coins, which is neat. The game itself is okay. It is about 35 years old after all. You control a futuristic sort of motorcycle trying to avoid obstacles and enemies. What does stand out is the collision system, as you can make enemies crash into walls. It is fun, but it also has some really weird issues, like you somehow clipping into the other side of an enemy and causing you to crash, or getting pushed way further away than you'd expect. Also, the game doesn't treat enemies as harshly when it comes to colliding with terrain. They're just sort of pushed away out of harm's way. This sort of stuff does make the game feel unfair, since any mistake costs you a life and they're pretty precious. And that's without even mentioning how the display ratio doesn't do it any service, as some stuff will at times feel unavoidable. That being said, I do like how the game can transition from a racing game in one stage to an obstacle course in the next. There is some range to it. All in all, it's okay, it's fine, and I appreciate the effort to archive these sorts of experiences. But realistically, it's not necessarily the sort of stuff I'd sink into having purchased a pretty expensive console. Still, it's there if you want to experience a piece of gaming history, and that's a good thing. Next, we have Garden of the Sea, a VR game made by Neat Corporation and I think ported to PSVR by Neko Software. In broad terms, this is like Animal Crossing but without a greedy raccoon landlord. It's a really cute, relaxing sandbox game where you build your own farm, explore islands with various biomes, interact with and befriend cute animals, and solve puzzles. It even has dolphin cows, which is a big plus. And I know for sure they're in part dolphins because they'll swim along with you as you travel on your boat. It's what I like to see in VR games, an open world, albeit small and segmented, loads of interactivity and ways to customize your play space. And the puzzles and their secrets are nice. Loads of cute stuff you can grow, cute interactions, stuff you can build, which I'd probably appreciate a lot more if I had a better sense of aesthetics. Or rather any at all. Definitely worth picking up if you want a relaxing and adorable VR experience. Going further on our list, we have Dungeon Color, my fave. In this game, you play as the Michelin Man, but smooth, as you play through several levels where you have to reach your exit point. The main gimmick of the game is that you can change colors by stepping on these plates and the same color doors will open up. Despite this sounding pretty simple, the game does manage to become more and more complex. The maps get bigger and bigger, and it adds new mechanics like locked doors and tokens that change colors throughout the map. Any mistake can lead to a reset, and you have to get pretty considerate about what you're doing. Other than that, there's not a lot I really have to say about it. It's pretty standard puzzle stuff. Except for one thing that I didn't really like. There's this one level that seems to be impossible, until I discovered by accident that actually one of the doors that you would not be able to open has one tile that lets you through. It's a very weird thing to do visually, and despite this being an intentional choice, it interestingly never gets used again. And honestly, good. And that's kind of it. Dungeon Color doesn't have anything really remarkable and is just kind of forgettable. We've now crossed the halfway point, with the sixth game being Day D, my favorite day. This seems to be a mobile game ported to consoles, and whatever your opinion may be on this sort of game, it's not actually all that bad. For context, there's a scientist who was able to create a time machine, but his nemesis, Dr. Awful, yep, not a lot of effort there, managed to make one before him and went back in time. So you follow him in an attempt to stop whatever he's doing there. The story is pretty much set dressing for the most part. The gameplay though is kind of interesting. It's a sort of twist between an RTS with resource management and a puzzle game. You control these small robots and you have to gather resources, clear or repair paths, and build new stuff. It's pretty neat, and I like how the robots have to visually travel places to do their thing, which you have to factor in because this takes time. And the game does have a grading system based on that, which I had to take into account because there's a trophy for getting 3 stars on all levels. Now the game does look rough around the edges, especially because levels are a 2D image and character models are 3D, which looks really silly sometimes. But apart from that, you can see that the game is made for mobile, or at least benefits from being controlled with a mouse. With a joystick, things are somewhat finicky to select. It's easy to select the wrong thing or just miss pressing the thing entirely, so that could have used a bit more work. But I like how the game tries to get creative with its own mechanics. As you progress, of course, there are some new mechanics to complicate stuff, like dinosaurs blocking your paths or markets that let you exchange one resource for another. They may not necessarily be the most creative mechanics, but I like how there are levels that use these mechanics for a one-off gimmicky experience, like a level where you can only trade to get other resources. And this sort of creativity lets them make levels where these mechanics are interwoven to make up challenges. So yeah, Day D through time is quite okay. It's a decent puzzle game that is easy to pick up and pretty fun despite looking quite rough at times. Good stuff if you're into that sort of game. Number 7 on our list is NeuroWorm, which doesn't actually have any screenshots on the store. That's odd. Released in 2022 by the Grave Robber Foundation, this game is basically if your old 2D Snake had a glow up. You play in first person and navigate one cube at a time, controlling your direction within a small time limit. It's pretty mind-bendy, with moves changing what is left or right and above and below. Your goal in each level is to navigate spaces that get more and more complex as you collect bits of data and grow in size. The gist of it is that you're a tool created to hack into people's devices, get compromising data or bank details in an attempt to support your... well, I don't know what this is supposed to be, some sentient system that keeps on growing. Again, the plot is pretty light to facilitate its gameplay, but it does have some funny stylistic touches, like an e-girl who turns out to be an old man, or a teacher with a severe foot fetish. Wait, I met someone like that! The game's progression can be split into 5 episodes, each focusing on one character and having 3 levels. The first level is the chill one. It's reasonably paced and lets you get used to the new mechanics the game introduces. The second is where things get chaotic. With each bit of data you collect, you get faster and faster, and yes, it does get as rough as it sounds. And then the last level combines that and also has an overall time limit. You get the idea, each set of 3 levels gets progressively harder, but each episode also introduces something to up the difficulty. You start out with mines, then your directional compass starts bugging out, which the first time I saw I was like, oh no! Then there are spaces that change perspectives, lines that make you move faster, or tiles that keep you one tile ahead. Basically, get ready for a headache, because this game is big on overloading your senses fast. While the premise sounds well and good and the game looks simplistic but nice, it does have some problems and we should talk about them. The biggest problem is the level design, not in the sense of their play space but more so in terms of environment. You see, while the levels look alright, the problem is trying to distinguish where you are and whether you can find the data bits in the area, because everything looks like everything. It's kinda like the idea of adding environmental cues so that the game communicates naturally where you are doesn't exist, and that makes things really confusing and frustrating. There's this one level, level 12, that is an absolute spatial clusterfuck. Let me try to explain it in Paint. This level is a cube split in the middle with no way to access one side from the other. Then in the middle there's this one crammed up room with bombs and some openings to those 2 sections, except that you have no way to know which is which. And then there's also tunnels around the inner circle with 2 speed tunnels interconnected in the middle, and Jesus fucking Christ, level 12 is the worst, and it doesn't help that it's one of those faster levels. Part of what exacerbates this is how the game plays with perspective and the spheres that change it. It's easy to take a wrong turn and damage yourself. And let's also talk about your compass glitching out, because it can glitch out for a long time. In a game that is hectic, disorienting and overall confusing, the compass represents something you can trust, and for the game to take that away feels frustrating. Lastly, I also feel that the color scheme doesn't do the game any favors. You see, the color of the data bits you have to collect have the same color as the level background, let's say. And in levels that are orange or red, they can be very easily confused for mines, because they're red, so the small box that encapsulates the data is also red. It's a leap of faith when you see these boxes with your peripheral vision, because you don't know what you're getting into. Ultimately, NeuroWorm is an okay project that unfortunately has a lot of issues. The game is fine and satisfying to complete because of its difficulty, but some simple touches could have gone a long way. A better visual system of cues would have been great and would have made navigation more seamless to interact with. Anyway, let's leave NeuroWorm aside and move on to the next game, Jade's Ascension. This one is created by Papas con Mojo Games, or Papas con Moyo Games. Look, I obviously don't particularly habla Espanol. Now, where to actually begin with this game? Visually, it's inspired by Chinese mythology, and gameplay-wise, it's like, let's say Diablo. If Diablo had a low enemy variety, no abilities, maps...
no corset, no boobs...
Okay, I'm of course being facetious. In reality, it's worse than that. Looking up the game, I found out that it was originally on Kickstarter, where it failed to reach its goal, which, as mean as it may sound, doesn't really surprise me based on what is shown here. Also, this page states that it's inspired by bullet hell games, which I don't see at all. What's interesting though is that at the time, this game seems to have been on the PlayStation Talents Game Camp, which already offers support in game making, so I'm not sure why it's on Kickstarter in the first place. Anyway, once you start the game, you have the choice of several characters, and you can choose to play with friends in case you don't have something better like, I don't know, Mario Party. Who these characters are, or anything like that, doesn't really exist. In fact, the Kickstarter page has a lot more info than the game itself. Either way, the characters don't really do anything unique. It's the same moveset where you just float around and shoot balls. What you do is basically fight increasing waves of enemies and advance floor by floor. Then there's also different towers that you can teleport to, and they have some differences in environment and enemies. Apart from that, once every few floors you can buy items and upgrades. And that's about it. There's really nothing more to it. Like, whereas games at least try to add some sort of story or purpose to at least provide some context, Jade's Ascension does nothing. I've no idea why any of this is happening. I don't even know what my goal is. Just for the heck of it, I tried reaching the 100th level on the Jade Tower, which is the one in which you start in. And the game just keeps on going with the exact same map you've seen in the past 100 floors. The enemy variety as well is severely lackluster. It's just two types of mobs, one of which cannot even harm you. So at that point, I just decided to focus on the trophies and be done with it, which is just about visiting the other towers and fighting their bosses. It was really easy and you could literally just get everything in one go. This was actually my second attempt. So the game is incredibly bare bones and has absolutely nothing going for it, but it's also quite poorly made, and I'm not saying that just because visually it's quite ugly. There's issues like the game showing you certain upgrades and not letting you buy them because you're already maxed out, or the game treating you as if you have 5 hearts whenever you enter a new temple, even if you've upgraded to more. Towers do feature different enemies, but there's nothing really noteworthy about them, except for these minotaurs who charge into you really fast and deal more damage than enemies usually do. Their animation is just peak design. You can really tell that the game is not even competently put together. It might be, again, harsh to say, but I don't see any reason to even create and sell this game. It's not unique, it's not creative, and it has such a small quantity of content. I'd actually go as far as to say that the game might be unfinished. The Kickstarter page talks about stuff that isn't even here, like, you know, a story. It somehow brought me back to the times where Steam would release really trash games because of Greenlight. In fact, it made me reminisce of a certain game made by a certain developer. If you know, you know. Though I can't say for sure that it's an asset flip, it's just really a bad game. Either way, there's nothing really positive to this. I can see why it's hidden away in the store. Let's move on. The ninth game is XX Mission, created by UPL and released in 1986. It's another game from the Arcade Archive series. This time you control a fighter jet and have to fight and survive for as long as you can. What's actually pretty neat is that the game distinguishes between ground and air units, so you have attacks that work for one target but not the other. But what's kinda cool is experiencing one of the earliest versions of what would be considered a bullet hell game. Take note, Jade's Ascension, this is what a bullet hell is. You need to be pretty precise and calculated as more and more enemies fill your screen, especially when it comes down to airplanes. They swarm you really fast and shoot back. One thing I definitely say I don't like is how there are some enemy units that are just hidden and invisible, but at least the game lets you get some whop. And that's about it. Again, the game is quite old. But a thing I find interesting is that the game lets you save scum the living fuck out of it. You can save at any point and return, and you can just use that save point liberally. Losing doesn't delete it. This is true for Seicross as well, and I guess it's nice. If you weren't that good at the game but curious about its later content, you can explore that via this feature. It's also useful if you just want to get your trophies and move on. Not that I know anyone who'd do that, so let's move on. And here we are at the last game, Off and On Again, also known as... Created by Ginger Biscuit Games and published by Subsilico, this game is kind of like Super Meat Boy without the meat. Or super. It's just boy. It's a 2D platformer that gets harder and more precise, and it's alright. It doesn't do anything that really sets it apart from other games within the same genre. The mechanic of changing terrain with switches is okay, the visual design is meh and simple, you have this AI companion that turns out to be evil and starts thinking its commentary is witty. I actually kinda like how when you die you become these several small cubes with physics, and there's also some multiplayer modes which aren't anything too exciting. But if I were to have a spectrum with Mario Party at one end and Jade's Ascension at the other, I'd say that is in the middle. Make of that what you will. Other than that, the game's trophies have quite a lot of padding. For whatever reason they're quite unclear, but they're about dying, using switches or jumping several hundreds of times, or finishing 100 multiplayer matches. This might be a way to prevent refunds from players that just want to get all of its trophies. But that's just a conspiracy. A game conspiracy. But all in all, it's just really pedestrian and not noteworthy. But hey, at least it's competently put together. And that's it, that's the 10 games at the bottom of the PlayStation Store list on this sale. If I were to choose the best game out of this list, it would definitely be Police Stories. And I'm not saying that just because I'm forcing myself to choose the best game. Police Stories is genuinely good. Great gameplay, plenty of options, and a fresh take on enemy interaction that has amazed me. It's really worth it, pick it up. The worst is kind of a toss-up between Murdered, Sole Suspect, and Jade's Ascension. Sole Suspect because it had the support of a big publisher and a fantastic game concept that they did fuck all with. Again, it's a great concept and I hope a competent studio will pick it up. Then Jade's Ascension because, well, it's just a bad game, lackluster, unfinished, and a snooze fest. In all fairness, Jade is probably the worst of the two, so I'll go with that as my worst pick. And that's all for this video. Definitely a rather interesting collection of games, and who knows, if the video does well, it might be the first of many such plungers into the PlayStation Store. Like and subscribe on your way out, thanks for watching and have a good one.